Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the quiet corridors of history. Tonight, let us drift together into the soft shadows of the past, where time slows and the echoes of forgotten lives begin to whisper. We invite you to relax, breathe deeply, and let your mind settle like dust in the still evening air. This evening, we turn not to the grandeur of emperors or the clamor of conquest, but to the quiet, steady rhythm of everyday life in the vast Roman Empire. Not the marble monuments, but the warm kitchens, the sunlit fields, the echoing bathhouses, and the worn tools of countless hands. These are the stories of the slaves of Rome, men and women whose lives were shaped not by choice, but by duty, repetition, and endurance. Their names are lost, but their presence was constant. They worked, they waited, and they carried the empire in silence. As you listen, let each word guide you into a state of calm. Let the weight of the modern world slip gently from your shoulders and allow yourself to rest in this soft exploration of the past. You are safe here. You are calm. Let the story unfold like a lullaby from history, steady, soothing, and full of quiet wonder. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, encompassing millions of square miles and countless cities, towns, and villages. From the bustling streets of Rome itself to the quiet farmsteads of Gaul, from the merchant ports of Alexandria to the frontier settlements along the Rhine, everywhere the eagle's standards flew, there were slaves. They were not a separate class living apart from Roman society, but woven into its very fabric, present in every household, every business, every public building. They were the invisible foundation upon which the visible world of Roman civilization rested. In the great houses of the wealthy, slaves moved through marble halls with practiced silence, their footsteps muffled by years of careful training. They knew which floorboards creaked, which doorways they required them to step aside when their masters approached, which corners of the house caught the morning light where they might pause for just a moment before returning to their duties. These domestic slaves lived in a world of routine so precise it had become second nature, where every gesture was calculated to be useful without being noticed. The agricultural slaves who worked the vast estates that fed the empire knew a different kind of rhythm, one tied to the seasons and the soil. They rose before dawn, when the air was cool and the dew still clung to the olive trees and grapevines. Their days were measured not in hours, but in rows planted, vines pruned, olives harvested, grain threshed. The sun marked their progress across the fields, and the changing position of shadows told them when to pause for their meager midday meal and when to begin the slow walk back to their quarters as evening approached.
In the cities, skilled slave craftsmen bent over their work in workshops that lined the narrow streets, their hands moving with the precision that came from years of repetition. The potter's wheel turned endlessly, the hammer rang against the anvil in steady rhythm, the stylus scratched across wax tablets in careful lines. These slaves possessed knowledge and skills that were valuable, yet they themselves remained property, their expertise belonging not to them, but to their masters. They worked in silence mostly, the only sounds the familiar ones of their trades, the scrape of tools, the whisper of clay taking shape, the soft scratch of pen on papyrus. Public slaves swept the forums before the city awakened, maintained the aqueducts that brought fresh water to the fountains, and kept the public baths clean and heated. They moved through the early morning streets like ghosts, completing their work before the free citizens emerged to begin their day. Their labor was essential, but invisible, noticed only when it was not done, appreciated only in its absence. The living quarters of slaves varied greatly depending on their roles and the wealth of their masters, but they shared a common simplicity, a reduction of life to its most basic elements. Domestic slaves and wealthy households might sleep in small chambers near the kitchen or in corridors that connected the main rooms, spaces designed for utility rather than comfort. These rooms were narrow, often windowless, containing little more than a sleeping mat, a clay lamp, and perhaps a wooden chest for the few personal possessions a slave might accumulate over the years. Agricultural slaves typically lived in communal quarters called ergastula, long, low buildings divided into cells barely large enough for a person to lie down. These structures were built for efficiency, housing as many workers as possible in the smallest space, with thick walls that kept out the heat of summer and the cold of winter, but also the light and air that might have made the spaces more livable. The floors were packed earth or rough stone, and the only furnishings were straw pallets that served as beds and rough wooden benches. Urban slaves in smaller households might sleep in the workshop where they labored during the day, curling up on the floor beside their tools when darkness fell. The bakery slave would rest near the ovens, still warm from the day's baking, while the scribe would clear a space among the scrolls and tablets that surrounded his work area. The boundary between work and rest was often no boundary at all, just a shift from one kind of stillness to another. The clothing of slaves was functional and durable, designed to last through years of hard use rather than to please the eye. Most wore simple tunics made of coarse wool or linen, dyed in earth tones that would not show dirt easily. These garments were often patched and mended, passed down from one slave to another, altered and adjusted to fit different bodies over time. In winter, a slave might wrap a cloak around their shoulders, and in the fields they would cover their heads with cloth to protect against the sun. Their feet might be shod with simple leather sandals or wrapped in cloth, or they might go barefoot, their soles hardened by years of walking on stone and earth. The daily routine of a slave began before dawn, in the quiet hour when the world was still dark and the air held the coolness of night. They would rise from their sleeping places without need of any call or signal, their bodies trained by years of practice to wake at the proper time. The first tasks were always the same: preparing the household for the day ahead, lighting the fires, drawing water, beginning the preparations for the morning meal. In the kitchen, slave cooks would start the day by grinding grain into flour, a task that required steady, rhythmic motion with the heavy stone quern. The sound of stone against stone would echo softly through the quiet house, mixing with the crackle of kindling as fires were lit in the braziers and ovens. Water had to be carried from the well or cistern, heavy clay amphora, lifted and balanced on shoulders that had grown strong from years of such labor.
The meals of slaves were simple and predictable, based on ingredients that were inexpensive and filling rather than flavorful or varied. The foundation of their diet was grain, usually barley or wheat, prepared as porridge, flat bread, or a kind of thick soup called pulse. This mixture would be cooked in large pots over open fires, stirred with wooden spoons until it reached the right consistency, neither too thick nor too thin, but substantial enough to provide energy for the long day ahead. To this basic grain preparation, other ingredients might be added, depending on the season and the generosity of the master. Olive oil was common, providing both flavor and needed fat. Vegetables that grew easily and in abundance might find their way into the slave meals. Onions, garlic, cabbage, turnips, leeks. These were vegetables that could be grown in poor soil, that stored well through the winter, that could feed many people without great expense. Legumes were another staple. Beans and lentils that could be dried and stored, then cooked into thick, nourishing stews. These provided protein that was otherwise scarce in the slave diet, and they could be prepared in large quantities to feed many people. The cooking of legumes required patience, long hours of slow simmering until the tough skins softened and the contents became digestible. Meat was rare in the slave diet, appearing perhaps on festival days or when an animal had died and needed to be consumed quickly before it spoiled. More commonly, slaves might receive small amounts of salted fish or the least desirable parts of animals slaughtered for their master's tables. These scraps would be added to the grain porridge or vegetable stews, providing a bit of additional protein and flavor. The eating of meals itself was a simple affair, conducted in whatever space was available near the kitchen or work areas. Slaves would gather in small groups, sitting on the ground or on rough wooden benches, sharing food from common pots, using wooden spoons or pieces of bread as utensils. The meals were consumed quickly and quietly, without the leisurely conversation that characterized dining among the free population. There was work to be done, and the meal was simply fuel for that work, consumed efficiently and without ceremony. The rhythm of eating followed the rhythm of work, with the main meal typically consumed at midday when the sun was highest and the heat made outdoor labor difficult. This meal would be more substantial than the simple breakfast of bread and watered wine that began the day, but still based on the same basic ingredients prepared in the same basic ways. In the evening, as the workday ended, there might be another small meal, often consisting of leftover porridge or bread, with perhaps a bit of olive oil or a few olives if the master was generous. The discipline that governed slave life was constant and pervasive, not requiring dramatic displays of force, but maintained through the steady pressure of routine and expectation. Every slave knew their place, their duties, their limitations, and the consequences of stepping beyond them. This knowledge was passed down from older slaves to younger ones, taught through observation and quiet instruction rather than formal lessons. The day was structured around work, with specific tasks assigned to specific times, and deviation from this structure was not tolerated. A kitchen slave knew that bread must be baked at a certain hour, that water must be available when the master woke, that meals must be prepared and served at the expected times. The timing of these duties was not flexible, and failure to complete them properly would result in punishment that could range from a reduction in food rations to physical correction.
Agricultural slaves worked under the constant supervision of overseers,
who monitored their progress through the fields, counted the rows completed, weighed the harvest collected. The pace of agricultural work was set by the seasons and the weather, but within those natural constraints, every moment was accounted for, every task measured and evaluated. The punishment for infractions was swift and certain, but it was also carefully calculated to maintain the slave's ability to work. A slave who was injured or incapacitated could not perform labor, and labor was the source of their value. So discipline was applied with the same practical consideration that governed every other aspect of slave management, designed to correct behavior and deter future problems while preserving the slave's capacity for useful work. Yet within this rigid structure, there were small spaces of rest, moments when the constant pressure of supervision relaxed slightly, when slaves could experience brief intervals of something approaching peace. These moments came in the early morning before the household stirred, when a slave might stand in the garden and watch the sky lighten from black to gray to pale gold. They came in the quiet of midday, when the heat forced even the masters to seek shade and rest, leaving slaves to continue their work in solitude. The evening hours after the day's tasks were completed offered another kind of respite. In the communal quarters where agricultural slaves lived, they might gather to share stories passed down from their homelands, songs remembered from childhood, traditions that connected them to lives lived before their enslavement. These gatherings were quiet affairs, conducted in whispers that would not carry to the ears of overseers, but they provided a kind of spiritual nourishment that the daily rations of grain and oil could not supply. In the houses of the wealthy, domestic slaves found their moments of rest in the performance of familiar tasks that required little conscious thought, allowing their minds to wander while their hands continued their work. The repetitive motion of grinding grain or spinning wool could become almost meditative, a rhythm that soothed the spirit even as it served the practical needs of the household. The hope that sustained slaves through the endless repetition of their days took many forms, but it was always present in some measure. For some, it was the hope of eventual freedom, the possibility that faithful service might be rewarded with manumission, the legal release from bondage that would allow them to live as freed persons. This hope was not unrealistic, as Roman law and custom did provide for the freeing of slaves under certain circumstances, though the decision remained entirely with the master. Others found hope in smaller things, in the accumulation of small privileges earned through years of reliable service, in the relationships formed with fellow slaves, in the preservation of memories and traditions from their former lives. The skilled craftsman might take pride in the quality of his work, even though he could not claim ownership of it. The house slave might find satisfaction in knowing the household routines so well that she could anticipate needs before they were expressed. The agricultural slaves who worked the land developed a connection to the natural cycles that govern their labor, finding in the changing seasons and the growth of crops a rhythm that existed beyond human control. The olive trees they tended would outlive them. The vines they pruned would bear fruit for generations after they were gone. And in this continuity there was a kind of immortality that transcended their individual circumstances. Memory became a form of resistance, a way of maintaining identity in a system designed to reduce people to their economic function. Slaves remembered their original names, even when they were given new ones by their masters. They remembered the faces of family members, the taste of foods from their homeland, the sound of their native languages. These memories were treasured and protected, shared carefully with trusted companions, passed down to children born in slavery who would never see the places their parents described, but could carry the knowledge of them in their hearts. The relationships between slaves provided another source of strength and continuity. In the large households of the wealthy, slaves developed complex social networks, hierarchies based on skill and seniority rather than legal status. The cook might mentor a young kitchen slave, teaching not just the techniques of food preparation, but also the unspoken rules of household survival. The head gardener would pass on not just knowledge of plants and soil, but also wisdom about reading the moods of masters and the political currents that flowed through the great houses. Among agricultural slaves, these relationships were even more crucial for survival. The experienced field hands taught newcomers how to pace themselves through the long days, how to avoid the attention of brutal overseers, how to find food and water when rations were short. They shared knowledge of which plants could be eaten safely, which remedies might help with illness or injury, which routes through the estate offered brief respites from surveillance. The children born into slavery learned their place in the world through observation and imitation rather than formal instruction. They watched their parents move through the routines of servitude, and they gradually absorbed the knowledge necessary for their own survival. A child born in the kitchen would learn to distinguish between the sounds of different cooking processes, to judge the readiness of bread by its smell, to carry water without spilling it, to move silently through the house. These children grew up with a dual awareness, understanding both their legal status as property and their human need for dignity and connection. They learned to navigate the complex emotional landscape of slavery, where love and loyalty could coexist with resentment and longing, where the desire for freedom lived alongside the practical need to accommodate to their circumstances. The passage of time in slave life was marked not by the formal calendar of the Roman world, with its political appointments and religious festivals, but by the natural rhythms of work and rest, planting and harvest, birth and death. The agricultural slaves knew the year by the tasks it brought: the pruning of vines in early spring, the grain harvest in summer, the olive picking in autumn, the dormant months of winter, when maintenance and repair filled the shorter days. Urban slaves measured time by the daily routines of their masters, the morning ceremonies of greeting clients, the afternoon business meetings, the evening meals and entertainments. They learned to read the social calendar of their households, to anticipate busy periods and quiet seasons, to prepare for the influx of guests during festival times, or the reduced activity during the hot months when many wealthy Romans retreated to their country estates. The religious life of slaves was complex and often hidden, conducted in the margins of the official Roman religious observances. Many slaves maintained connections to the gods and practices of their homelands, adapting these traditions to their new circumstances, finding ways to observe them despite the constraints of their daily lives. They might whisper prayers to distant deities while grinding grain or working in the fields, seeking protection and guidance from powers that existed beyond the reach of Roman law. Some slaves were drawn to the mystery religions that flourished in the cosmopolitan environment of the empire, cults that offered spiritual equality and the promise of salvation regardless of social status. These religions provided hope for a better existence after death, a cosmic justice that would balance the inequities of earthly life. The initiation rites and secret ceremonies of these cults offered slaves a space where their humanity was recognized and celebrated, where they could experience a sense of belonging that transcended their legal status. The knowledge that slaves possessed was vast and practical, accumulated through years of close observation and hands-on experience. The house slaves knew their masters' habits and preferences better than family members, understanding the subtle signals that indicated mood changes, the small rituals that brought comfort, the foods that were preferred and those that should be avoided. This intimate knowledge was both a burden and a form of power, creating a dependency that could work in both directions. Skilled slaves often possessed technical knowledge that was highly valued, techniques of craftsmanship that had been passed down through generations, methods of production that were closely guarded secrets. The blacksmith slave knew the precise temperature needed for different types of metalwork. The baker slave understood the subtle chemistry of fermentation. The scribe slave was literate in multiple languages and writing systems. This expertise made them valuable property, but it also gave them a measure of security and sometimes small privileges.
The medical knowledge possessed by many slaves was particularly important in an era when professional medical care was expensive and often ineffective. Slave women often served as midwives and healers, using traditional remedies and practical experience to treat illness and injury among both the slave and free populations. This knowledge was transmitted orally from one generation to the next, a treasure trove of practical wisdom that represented centuries of accumulated experience. The economic impact of slave labor on the Roman economy was enormous, but largely invisible in the historical record. Slaves produced the food that fed the cities, manufactured the goods that filled the markets, built the roads and aqueducts that connected the empire, cleaned and maintained the public and private spaces where free Romans conducted their business and social lives. The wealth of the Roman elite was built on this foundation of unpaid labor, and the comfortable lifestyle of the urban middle class depended on the services provided by domestic slaves. Yet the individual slaves who made this economic system possible remain largely anonymous in the historical sources. We know them primarily through their functions rather than their personalities, through the work they performed rather than the lives they lived. The archaeological record provides some glimpses of their material culture, the simple pottery they used, the modest quarters where they lived, the tools they worked with. But their thoughts, hopes, fears, and dreams are largely lost to history. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural life created periods of intense activity alternating with times of relative quiet. The harvest season brought long days of back-breaking labor as slaves raced to gather crops before they spoiled or weather damaged them. These were periods when every available person was pressed into service, when the normal routines of the household were suspended in favor of the urgent need to bring in the harvest. During these busy times, the pace of life accelerated, and the usual boundaries between different types of work became blurred. House slaves might find themselves in the fields. Skilled craftsmen might be assigned to help with processing grain or olives, and even privileged slaves, like tutors or secretaries, might be called upon to assist with the physical labor of harvest time. The winter months brought a different kind of rhythm, slower and more contemplative, as the agricultural work shifted to maintenance and preparation for the coming year. This was the time for repairing tools and equipment, for planning the next year's planting, for the countless small tasks that kept the estate functioning.
It was also a time when slaves might have more opportunity for rest and reflection, when the pressure of urgent deadlines eased and the pace of life slowed to match the shortened days and longer nights. The foods consumed by slaves varied with the seasons and the local environment, but the basic pattern remained consistent throughout the Roman world. The diet was based on grains, supplemented with vegetables, legumes, and small amounts of oil and wine. In coastal areas, slaves might receive fish as part of their rations, while those in regions where olive trees grew would have more oil in their diet. Wine was usually watered down when given to slaves, providing calories and some nutritional value while avoiding the expense of full-strength wine. The preparation of slave meals was itself a form of labor, assigned to specific individuals who became skilled in cooking large quantities of simple foods efficiently. These cooks learned to make the most of limited ingredients, to prepare filling meals that would provide energy for hard physical work, to stretch supplies when provisions were short. They developed techniques for cooking over open fires, for managing large pots and crude utensils, for timing multiple dishes so that meals would be ready when needed. The eating of meals was a social time for slaves, one of the few occasions when they could gather together and share not just food but conversation and companionship. These meals were often the only time when slaves from different parts of the estate or household would interact, creating opportunities for the exchange of information, the sharing of news, the maintenance of relationships that provided emotional support in the harsh reality of slave life. The night brought a different quality of existence for slaves, a time when the constant oversight of masters and overseers relaxed somewhat, when the pace of activity slowed, when there might be moments of genuine quiet and rest. The darkness provided a kind of cover for private thoughts and conversations, for the expression of feelings and ideas that had to be suppressed during the daylight hours of labor.
In the slave quarters, the evening hours were often devoted to the maintenance of whatever personal possessions slaves were able to accumulate, the mending of clothing, the care of simple tools, the preparation for the next day's work. These tasks were performed by the light of small oil lamps or the glow of cooking fires, creating pools of warm light in the darkness where slaves could focus on these intimate, personal activities. The conversations that took place during these evening hours were precious to slaves, opportunities to share memories of home, to discuss the events of the day, to offer comfort and advice to one another. These talks were conducted in low voices, with constant awareness of the need for discretion, but they provided an essential outlet for the human need for communication and connection. Sleep came as a mercy at the end of each long day, a temporary escape from the realities of slave life, a time when consciousness could rest and the body could recover from the day's labors. The sleeping arrangements were simple and utilitarian, designed to accommodate the maximum number of people in the minimum space, but they provided the essential functions of shelter and security. The quality of sleep was often poor, as slaves were crowded together in small spaces, subject to disturbance from others, uncomfortable on hard surfaces with minimal bedding. Yet sleep was so desperately needed that exhausted bodies learned to find rest despite these conditions, to sink into unconsciousness despite noise and discomfort,
to take whatever recovery was possible in the brief hours between the end of one day's work and the beginning of the next. Dreams provided another form of escape, a realm where slaves could experience freedom, could remember loved ones, could imagine different possibilities for their lives. These dreams were private and personal, beyond the reach of masters and overseers, spaces where the human spirit could roam freely despite the constraints of physical bondage. The legacy of Roman slavery extends far beyond the boundaries of the ancient world, influencing legal systems, economic structures, and social relations for centuries after the fall of the empire. The efficiency of Roman slave-based agriculture provided a model that was studied and emulated by later civilizations, while the legal frameworks developed to regulate slavery influenced the development of property law and labor relations in medieval and modern societies. Yet the human cost of this system remains largely uncounted and unremembered. The millions of individuals whose lives were consumed in the service of Roman prosperity left few traces in the historical record. Their experiences preserved only in fragments of pottery, in the foundations of buildings they constructed, in the agricultural terraces they carved into hillsides, in the occasional legal document that mentions them as property to be bought, sold, or inherited. The silence that surrounds the individual lives of Roman slaves is itself a form of historical evidence, a reminder of how thoroughly systems of oppression can erase the humanity of those they exploit. The voices of the enslaved were not recorded, their stories were not told, their perspectives were not preserved because they were not considered worthy of historical attention by those who had the power to write and preserve the records of their time. In the quiet hours of the night, when the Roman world settled into sleep, the slaves who had labored through another day would find their own rest in whatever comfort they could create for themselves. The house slave would settle onto her sleeping mat near the kitchen, listening to the dying embers of the cooking fire crack and whisper in the darkness. The field slave would lie on his straw pallet in the ergastulum, feeling the ache in his muscles gradually ease as his body prepared for the recovery that sleep would bring.
These moments of transition from wakefulness to sleep were among the most private and personal experiences available to slaves. Times when they could exist simply as human beings rather than as economic units, when their consciousness could drift away from the harsh realities of their waking lives into the gentler realm of dreams and rest. In these quiet moments, surrounded by the breathing of their fellow slaves, they could find a kind of peace that the daylight hours rarely offered. The rhythm of breathing would gradually slow and synchronize among the sleeping slaves, creating a quiet harmony that filled the dark spaces where they rested. This shared rhythm of sleep was one of the few things that connected them to the natural world and to their own humanity, a reminder that beneath the imposed identities of property and labor, they remained human beings with the same basic needs for rest, for comfort, for the restoration that sleep provides. And so the night would pass in this quiet rhythm, as it had for countless nights before, and would for countless nights to come, the steady breathing of the enslaved providing the unheard soundtrack to the great Roman Empire.
the foundation of silence upon which all the recorded history of that civilization rested. In the morning, they would wake to another day of labor, another cycle of work and rest, another turn in the endless rhythm of lives lived in service to others, lives that found their meaning not in freedom or recognition, but in the simple persistence of human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The survival of the human spirit within the constraints of slavery was perhaps the greatest achievement of these forgotten millions, a testament to the resilience of hope and the power of memory to preserve identity across generations of bondage. Their legacy lives not in monuments or inscriptions, but in the endurance of the human capacity to find meaning and connection even in the most restrictive circumstances, to maintain dignity and compassion even when treated as property, to preserve love and loyalty even when denied the freedom to express them openly. As the Roman Empire gradually transformed and eventually fell, the institution of slavery evolved but did not disappear, carrying forward into new forms and new societies the fundamental contradiction between human dignity and economic exploitation that had characterized the Roman system. The voices of the enslaved remained largely silent in the historical record, but their presence shaped every aspect of the world they helped to build, their labor creating the wealth that funded the art and literature that we still admire, their knowledge and skills contributing to the technological and cultural achievements that we still study and celebrate. In the end, the story of Roman slavery is not just a chapter in ancient history, but a reminder of the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance, a lesson in how systems of power can reduce human beings to economic functions, while never entirely succeeding in extinguishing the spark of humanity that makes each individual life precious and irreplaceable. The slaves of Rome lived and died largely in silence, but their lives were no less meaningful for being unrecorded, their struggles no less heroic for being unsung, their humanity no less complete for being denied by the laws and customs of their time.